Hello everyone, it's Olivia here, aka Story Minded, and I'm just going to sort of make the final video for today for the ICSE English language for the Edexcel exam board video. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the first stanza of one of the anthology poems in there, and I'm going to be looking at Disabled by Wilfred Owen. Just to give a bit of context about the poet, I'm not an expert on Wilfred Owen. I haven't really studied him that much, but from what I can remember and what I've looked up, Wilfred Owen was a soldier in World War One, and he was a poet of war poetry for World War One. But the very fascinating thing, and what he's probably most famous for, is the fact that unlike other poets at the time of World War One, where they tended to glorify war and sort of buy into the propaganda of patriotism and patriotic sort of themes, as in, like, you know, you're going to fight for your king and country, you're going to go and win the war and all that sort of stuff. Wilfred Owen was very ahead of his time in the sense that his poetry is completely different to that. He's very realistic, and he's very brutally honest in sort of the devastation of war, and he wrote a lot about one of his famous poems. I can never remember the name of it, but he wrote about the mustard gas, the use of mustard gas in World War One, which was absolutely horrific. The effects of that were just devastating and life-changing. And I guess what I'm going to do, I'm going to sort of analyse this first stanza of this poem. I haven't actually written any notes down, so I'm going to sort of analyse it live, and I'm going to try and pick out as many sort of writing techniques that I know about, and I'll try and explain them a bit to you and just sort of show you how I would analyse a poem. But the reason why I mentioned a bit about Wilfred Owen to start with is it's really important to try and get a bit of context about these writers. If you have an anthology, look into the writers and see what they write about, what they're trying to do, because that can give you some idea on what techniques they're using and what they're writing for, what their purpose is, all those kinds of things. So I'll read out the first bit to you. So it's Disabled by Wilfred Owen. He sat in a wheeled chair, waiting for dark, and shivered in his ghastly suit of grey, legless, sewn short at elbow. Through the park voices of boys rang saddening like a hymn, voices of play and pleasure after day, till gathering sleep had mothered them from him. So that's just the first stanza. Let's have a look. So I would always say the title is very important. A lot of people don't think about titles when they analyse a text, and I would always highly recommend look at the title first. The title has been picked for a reason, and what can we get from this title of Disabled? Well, it's a very definite title. It's a very direct title, and what I mean by that is there is no room for negotiation, there's no room for hope, there's no room for possibility. It's literally just disabled. That is it, which has given us a clue to what this poem is going to be about. Whoever we're about to follow, they are disabled. That is their future, that is their present, that is everything. And it's just a one-word title, and it's so impactful. It's just, there's no hope. It's a label. There's so much you can gather from just that single word title. And it kind of gives an indication that this is more likely than not going to be a very sort of poignant, a very sad, which means sad, a very sort of sad poem. Okay, so let's look at the first line. He sat in a wheeled chair, and then there's a comma, which I will explain in a minute, and waiting for dark, comma. So the first thing I'll say about the comma in the middle, and I'll just flip up, sorry, you're probably not going to be able to read my writing, but I've just circled it there. That is a comma in the middle of a line, and in poetry, I don't know if they teach this at GCSE, but I will teach it to you now. That is called Caesura. when you get a pause, and it can be a full stop as well, but when you get a pause, a piece of punctuation in the middle of a line in a poem, that is called Caesura. And that can have so many different effects, and it's a structural device in poetry. So a Caesura is just a fancy way of saying a pause in the middle of a line of poetry. And this is significant because it's next to "he sat in a wheeled chair." Then we get the pause. So when you read that, you stop. So because that has been positioned next to this wheeled chair, we are placed into position that this narrative voice, the person who is narrating the poem, it's an omniscient narrative voice, because the person in the wheelchair, although the poem is about him, we don't hear his voice. There is like an outside force that is looking over him and is telling his story. So that means we are now, this technique has placed us in the position of this soldier. We are trapped in this wheelchair with him. Caesura can be used to create this feeling of entrapment. He can't walk, he's stuck in this wheelchair, and now we are immediately stuck with him. And then we have, after that, "waiting for dark," which is so sad. It's a very sort of empty line, like the feeling. You can talk about atmosphere in poetry, the fact that we've got this description of dark. Once again, thinking back to the title, it links to this idea that there is no hope for this person. They're literally just waiting for dark. They're not waiting for anything. And also, before the Caesura, we have the word chair, and then after we have the word waiting. And this is a form of assonance, which is Assonance. And assonance is when we have a similarity in a group of words or syllables next to each other, and it can be to do with either the consonants or the vowel sounds. So this is an example of assonance with the vowel sounds, because chair has an AI and waiting has an AI, so it's assonance. And what assonance can do is it makes you pay attention to particular words, because the sounds are similar and they connect to each other, which can obviously create a lot of significant meaning. And in this case, we have chair, the pause, and then waiting. So these two ideas are linked together. Not only is he waiting, he is stuck in this chair. His whole life has become a continuous, never-ending moment of waiting, and it's this chair that has become his prison. There's so much you can draw from it. So we now know that these two ideas are closely linked. On to the next line. "And shivered in his ghastly grey suit of grey." So that ghastly suit of grey is alliteration, because even if you've got the two different words between it, we have the two G's. So that's alliteration, which is where words start with the same letter. And that's another sort of structural device. And this idea of ghastly grey, it's a very sort of dark imagery. And ghastly, that sort of description, it reminds me personally a lot about like ghosts or something of the supernatural. Like if something's ghastly, it's not a positive image to be structuring. And this idea that has been combined with a suit, which normally you would think of a suit as a positive, like quite a positive thing, like a formal outfit, but this has obviously created this kind of contradiction, this ghastly suit of grey. And once again, like with the colour of dark above it, it's another very sort of, you can talk about colour connotations, so different colours will make us feel and think about different things, and grey, once again, links to dark, which is like death, loneliness, isolation, boredom, mundane. Grey can be seen as a very mundane sort of colour. And the description, the action of him, he shivered, so he's cold, you could potentially draw the connotations of that. He is lifeless. So much you can draw from it. then we've, and the end stop lines obviously make you, that's when you have a bit of punctuation at the end of the line, that makes you stop again. So we're constantly being stopped in this poem, or for these first two lines we are anyway. And then we have legless, another piece of Caesura, sewn short at elbow. So the fact that we pause after we read legless, that really draws your attention as a reader to that word. So this poor man is, he's obviously lost his legs in war, which is why it's important you understand context, because obviously Wilfred Owen, First World War poet, most likely this soldier has had his legs blown off by a bomb, which is horrific. And then sewn short at elbow, so he's an amputee. And that's, sewn short, that's a version of sibilance, which is to do with S sounds and the sh. Any words that make you sort of make a hiss sound, that would be sibilance. Which can, once again, a bit like assonance, it'll group words together and it will draw your attention to them. So sewn short, and that is quite a harsh sound. So this idea that once again we're really trapped. This person's life has been completely transformed by their war injury and sewn short. There's no escape, there's no future, no hope, no positivity. And this is how you gain the higher marks when you analyse in English. It's all these little things that keep building up to this bigger image. So the more you can say, for example, you identify something in a poem. So I've identified this theme of like entrapment. If you can then use lots of different writing techniques and examples to explain why this poem creates a real sense of entrapment. Obviously, it depends on what the question is asking you to do. That is how you build up your answer and how you build up the strength of your answer. It's all finding the evidence for what you're trying to say. And then we have another Caesura, but this time with the full stop. And then we have, through the park, voices of boys rang, saddening like a hymn. And this is where we have, I'll try and flip my writing around again. Sorry, I'll try and show you. Where are we? Through the park. It obviously makes it go back. This bit here, there is no end stop line. On these ones we have the commas, which are the end stop lines that make you pause. This one doesn't. And when you don't have a piece of punctuation at the end of the line, and it makes you read on to the next line, that is called enjambment, which is ENJAMBMENT. So like I just said, enjambment makes you go on to the next line, it makes you continue to read on. And this can be very significant if you've had previous Caesura, or vice versa. If you started with enjambment and then suddenly you get these pauses, it can play around with the meaning, and it's another structural device in poetry. So we have, through the park, voices of boys rang saddening like a hymn. So it's interesting how the enjambment has been coupled with this setting of a park. That can create a lot of sort of connotations, such as like parks, you think of freedom, you think of the countryside, you think of rural, you think of all these sort of pastoral, which is just another word for countryside, like all these open spaces and freedom. It's this idea of freedom which he isn't able to access anymore because he's stuck in this wheelchair. And the enjambment sort of emphasizes this idea of like this freedom, and he hears the voices of boys that rang saddening like a hymn, which is quite a contradiction. So we have this very sort of open setting, and these voices of boys, the boys that he, like the boy he used to be before he obviously went to war and got his legs blown off and everything like that. There's kind of this like there's this connection there that this is how he used to be, but he's not anymore, which is probably why it ends with another end stop line, because you stop. And it's interesting how they have this simile of saddening like a hymn, and a hymn is like a obviously a song of praise, like worship, to do with the idea of God and everything like that. And saddening like a hymn, it's quite a contradiction, or another word of contradiction in English literature or language is juxtaposition. which is where two images contradict each other. So a hymn is a song of praise, so you'd think it'd be uplifting and positive, but because we've got rang saddening like a hymn, there's kind of this emptiness there, which probably links back to the fact that he is no longer like this. He is not free. He's trapped in his wheelchair. And then we go on to the next line, voices of play and pleasure after day. Play and pleasure. So once again, we've got assonance, or more so with this one, you could talk about consonants, assonance and consonants. I think we tend to, in here, we tend to use assonance, but apparently America uses consonants more. But I swear I've used consonants before, and I'm sure it's fine to use because we've got play and pleasure. So we've got the pl, which is consonants because P and L aren't vowels. So there's kind of a similarity between those words. And this idea of the repetition of voices. So you could make a point about the fact that where it's repeating the repetition of voices, it's kind of like he's almost like haunted by this. Voices and play and pleasure after day. It's interesting how it says after day as well. So it's almost like this continuous, monotonous life that he's living. And the last line I think is very powerful, where it's till gathering sleep had mothered them from him. So we have a personification here of sleep, and personification is when you give something, an object, or in this case a thing, sleep, you apply human attributes to something. So inanimate objects or just nouns, you personify them, and sleep has been personified because we talk about till gathering sleep had mothered them from him. So this creates imagery and this idea that sleep is the one comfort that he has left. Sleep has been turned into a mother figure for this soldier, and it's kind of this idea that sleep is the one way he can escape all his pain, all his suffering, all his boredom is just to sleep, which really drives home, and this is just the first stanza, to really drive home this idea that he is just, there's just no hope, there's nothing for him to look forward to, he's trapped, and sleep is the one escape he has, and it's mothered them from him. So sleep is the only comfort he gets from the fact that he cannot walk in the park. He cannot join in with play and pleasure anymore because he is trapped. And as you can see, this is a very long video. And that, I got all of that just from those first couple of lines. That's not even the whole poem, that's just the first stanza, the first sets of lines. So anyway, I hope that's helped in some way. Any questions, please feel free to let me know. That was just an example of how I would analyse a piece of poetry. And if any of you have watched this and you thought that looks really difficult and really tricky, my best advice to you would be look up literature techniques or writing techniques, whatever you want to call them, because the more you understand what a technique is, the more you'll be able to spot them in a piece of writing. And obviously this is something that I've done for many years, and because I also do creative writing, because I love it and I enjoy it, I use the techniques that writers like Wilfred Owen use. So when you use them in your own creative work, it becomes a lot easier to spot in other people's work, because you're like, oh yeah, I use this, so I know what's going on and what's happening. But anyway, if anyone's watched this, thank you, and hopefully I'll make another video soon. Bye.